In this chapter, we shift from theory to practice and look closely at how literary research is actually done. The chapter draws heavily on the Handbook to Literary Research, edited by Delia D'Souza Correa and W.R. Owens, which is one of the most helpful guides for beginners. Think of this chapter as a roadmap. It shows you the steps, the tools, and the decisions that shape the journey from an idea to a full research project. We begin by understanding that literary research doesn't happen in one straight line. It involves a series of steps, including empirical approaches where you gather evidence and decision-making strategies, where you choose the direction of your study. One of the most important early steps is the literature review. Here, the chapter explains not only what a literature review is, but how you actually do it. It walks you through each stage, searching for sources, selecting the relevant ones, reading them critically, and finally organizing them. Leading scholars offer suggestions on useful tools and resources, helping you understand how a good review lays the foundation for stronger research later on. From here, the chapter moves to the idea of a hypothesis in literary research. We usually associate hypotheses with scientific work, but they can be used in literature too. A hypothesis in literary studies is simply a tentative idea or assumption that guides your reading and interpretation. The chapter explains when a hypothesis is needed, how to form one, and how it helps you stay focused during your research. The next section dives into the tools and techniques that every researcher should know. This includes using both online and printed sources, a point highlighted by Shafqat Tauheed. He also explains the hierarchy of preparation in research, basically showing the order in which you should prepare your materials and ideas before you begin writing. Correa and Owens add to this by outlining how to collect material in a systematic way. They stress the importance of bibliographical awareness, archival access, and careful evaluation of both primary and secondary materials. At the center of this discussion is bibliography, and here the work of Simon Elliott becomes very useful. He explains 4 key types of bibliography: descriptive, analytical, enumerative, and historical. Understanding these types helps you see how books are described, organized, and studied in scholarly settings. This is essential knowledge, especially when you're trying to locate or examine materials for your own project. Toward the end of the chapter, we turn to the actual process of writing and presenting research. This includes choosing a topic, shaping it into a clear argument, which, by the way, has been asked in exam, structuring your project, preparing a proposal, and eventually writing your dissertation or thesis. W.R. Owens offers guidance on organization, drafting, and presentation, reminding you that good research requires both intellectual discipline and ethical responsibility. The chapter then closes with a set of practical exercises. These activities train you to search effectively, evaluate sources, edit your work, and plan your project. They form a bridge between theory and real practice, helping you build confidence as a researcher. By the time you finish this chapter, you'll not only understand how literary research works, but you'll also feel prepared to conduct your own work with clarity, honesty, and independence. It equips you with the skills needed for academic success, especially in exams like the UGC NET, and helps you approach literary research as a meaningful, rewarding process. Let's walk through the steps of literary research one by one in a way that feels practical and easy to follow. These steps often appear in exam, sometimes directly, sometimes hidden inside questions. Understanding them clearly will make your research journey much smoother. We begin with choosing and refining a research topic. Most students start with a broad area they find interesting, like post-colonial novels or modern poetry. But that's only the first step. You then narrow it down: which author, which text, which theme or theory. The more specific your topic becomes, the stronger your research foundation will be. The next step is the literature review, where you explore what other scholars have already said about your topic. You look through bibliographies, journals, and databases. You note the major arguments, debates, and gaps. This stage tells you where your own research can contribute something meaningful. Now comes a very important step, formulating your research questions or hypotheses. Based on the scholarship you've read, you decide what you want to answer. What exactly are you trying to show or understand? You also set your objectives, the ideas you hope to explore, and the theoretical angle you plan to use. Once you know your research questions, you choose the theoretical framework and methods. Maybe you want a feminist perspective or a post-colonial one, or a biographical approach. You also decide on methods such as close reading, textual criticism, archival research, or discourse analysis. This step shapes the entire direction of your study. Next, you gather your sources. These come in two forms. Primary sources are the original texts, novels, poems, manuscripts, letters, or rare editions. Secondary sources include criticism, journal articles, and theoretical essays that help you interpret the primary text. After gathering sources, you must evaluate them. Are they reliable? Who wrote them? When were they published? What biases might be present? This is also where you use bibliographies, indexes, and digital archives to strengthen your work. Then comes organizing. You take notes and plan your structure. You keep full bibliographic details and prepare an outline or chapter plan. Good organization early on saves a lot of confusion later. With everything in place, you begin to write your drafts. This includes your introduction, theoretical background, and detailed analysis of the text. You interpret, compare, and support your arguments with evidence. As you write, you also need to cite your sources correctly. Whether you use MLA, Chicago, or any other style, consistency is essential. Proper citation protects you from plagiarism and builds the credibility of your work. Near the end, you revise and refine your writing. You review the coherence, logic, and accuracy of your argument. You proofread carefully and check formatting, citations, and overall style. Feedback from peers or teachers can help at this stage. Finally, if required, you present or publish your research. You may defend your thesis, present in a seminar, or submit your work for publication. This completes the cycle of literary research. Now, let's look at something quite different, the steps of empirical research. Although empirical methods belong mainly to scientific and social science fields, UGC NET sometimes tests the differences, and one of the steps forming a hypothesis has been asked in exam. Empirical research begins with a research question. You identify a specific problem that you want to study, something that can be tested using observation or data. For example, you might ask whether listening to happy music at work increases creativity. The second step is reviewing the existing literature. Just like in literary research, you check what earlier researchers have found, you look for gaps or debates that your study can address. The third step is to form a hypothesis, a testable prediction about the outcome. This step has been asked in exam, so remember it. A hypothesis tells you what relationship you expect between variables, such as predicting that happy music will promote creativity. Next, you choose a research methodology. In empirical studies, you may select a quantitative method like surveys or experiments, a qualitative one like interviews or observations, or a mixed method that combines both. Once your method is fixed, you collect and analyze data. For quantitative research, this means using numerical data and statistical tools. For qualitative research, you look for themes and patterns. This process of analyzing data, especially through statistical methods, has also appeared in exam. Finally, you draw conclusions and report your findings. You interpret the data, decide whether your hypothesis was supported, and write a clear report explaining your methods, results, and conclusions. Reporting findings has also been tested in exam. You may also suggest what future research could explore. When we talk about doing research, it often feels like a huge and complicated journey. But once we break it into clear steps, the whole process becomes much easier to understand. Let's walk through the main stages of decision making in research one by one in a simple and friendly way. Everything begins with choosing a research topic or theme, and this very step has been asked in exam. At this stage, you simply think about what interests you. It could be something connected to your academic goals or even a personal curiosity. The idea is to pick a broad area that genuinely excites you because you'll be spending a lot of time exploring it. Once you have a topic, the next step is formulating the research problem, another point that has appeared in exam. This means narrowing the topic into something more precise and answerable. For example, instead of a general topic like unemployment, you might ask, how does unemployment affect mental health among people aged 18 to 25? This turns a big subject into something focused and researchable. After that, you move to the review of literature and theory, which has also been noted in exam. Here, you explore what other scholars have already said about your problem. You read books, articles, and essays to understand existing ideas, methods, and debates. This step helps you identify gaps in knowledge and shows you where your work can add something meaningful. Next comes setting research objectives and hypotheses, a step that has been mentioned in exam as well. Your objectives tell the reader what you aim to find out, and your hypothesis offers a prediction or assumption that your study will test. Together, they give your research clear direction. Following this, we come to conceptualization and operationalization, both of which have been asked in exam. Conceptualization means defining exactly what you mean by the key terms in your study. For instance, if your topic involves mental health, you must explain which aspects of mental health you are focusing on. Operationalization takes this a step further by deciding how you will measure those concepts in real life using surveys, scales, interviews, or other tools. Once your concepts are clear, you choose your research design and decide on your sampling method. Here, you ask questions like, will your study be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed? How many participants do you need? How will you select them? A good sample makes sure that your findings can be applied to the larger group you are studying. Then comes data collection, another step that has been asked in exam. This is where you gather information through surveys, interviews, observations, or experiments. It is the stage where your research actually becomes active. After collecting the data, you move into analysis and interpretation, which again has been tested in exam. In quantitative research, you might use statistical tools. In qualitative research, you look for patterns, themes, and meanings. Once the analysis is complete, you interpret the results and explain what they mean in relation to your research objectives and hypotheses. Finally, you report and share your findings. This could be a research paper, a presentation, or a dissertation. The goal is to communicate what you discovered so others can learn from it, build on it, or challenge it. Now, a crucial part of this entire process is the literature review, which has also appeared in exam. A literature review is like taking a guided tour through everything scholars have already written on your topic. But it's not just a summary. It is a critical discussion that helps you map out the field, understand debates, identify gaps, and build the foundation for your own argument. A good literature review does several things. It helps you spot key studies and theories. It shows you where to find primary and secondary sources, such as editions, manuscripts, or archival documents. It helps you notice underexplored areas that can strengthen your thesis. And it proves that you understand scholarly conventions, especially citation and research ethics. There is also a step-by-step way to conduct a strong literature review. You begin by narrowing your topic, making sure it is manageable. Then you do a preliminary survey, starting with online resources and moving toward university libraries and major archives. This saves time and helps you quickly identify key authors, journals, and editions. Next, you read with purpose. You scan the material with certain questions in mind. Who are the major thinkers in this area? What debates shape this topic? Which gaps can my work fill? As you do this, you build a working bibliography using tools like Abel, Lion, JSTOR, Project Muse, and WorldCat, all extremely useful databases for literary studies. You then evaluate your sources. Not all publications are equal. You check the author's credentials, the reputation of the journal or publisher, the date, and the originality of the argument. You take careful notes, recording every page number and citation because accuracy matters in research. Once you've gathered enough material, you organize the literature into themes or debates. You look for connections, disagreements, and unanswered questions. This helps you move to the next key step, turning your survey into an argument, something that has also been asked in exam. A strong dissertation or thesis always has an argument at its center. Finally, you write your literature review in a clear, critical voice, highlighting not just what others have said, but why it matters for your topic. And remember, a literature review is never really closed. You update it as you discover new sources or refine your own ideas. Altogether, these steps from choosing your topic to reviewing literature and sharing your findings form the backbone of any serious research project. Understanding them not only helps you plan your work, but also gives you the confidence to carry out research that is thoughtful, systematic, and meaningful. Let's take a look at something students often find confusing: the role of a hypothesis in literary research. We usually associate hypotheses with science, experiments, and lab work, but they can also be useful in literature, especially when our study involves comparison, measurement, or theory. The key difference is that scientific hypotheses are tested through experiments, while in literary research we test hypotheses through textual evidence, interpretation, and analysis. In simple words, a hypothesis is a provisional explanation or a temporary statement that we assume to be true so we can explore it further. This idea of a hypothesis as a provisional explanation has been asked in exam. Think of it as a starting point, a claim you want to test by reading closely, analyzing patterns, and examining arguments. Sometimes, a hypothesis is formed during the research process or even after you've gathered some evidence. When that happens, it is known as an inductive hypothesis, a term that has also appeared in exam. You observe something in a text, ask yourself why it happens, and then form a statement that you can test through further study. Now let's look at when a hypothesis is actually useful in literary studies. It works best when the research involves something measurable, comparative, or theory-based. For example, in comparative studies, a hypothesis helps you compare techniques or themes across writers or periods. You might say the anti-hero in Shakespeare's tragedies shows less psychological depth than in Dostoevsky's novels. This gives you a clear direction and something specific to check in both writers. In quantitative analysis, especially with digital tools, hypotheses can be tested using word frequencies, sentence lengths, or stylistic patterns. You might propose there is a significant connection between sentence length and the complexity of a character's inner thoughts in modernist fiction. Here, you can actually measure, count, and test your idea. A hypothesis is also helpful when applying theory. For instance, a Marxist reading of Pride and Prejudice shows that economic status, more than social class, shapes character decisions. This guides you to read the novel through a particular lens and see whether the evidence supports your claim. So how do we formulate a hypothesis in literary research? The process is easier than it sounds and follows a natural flow. We begin with observation. Maybe you notice a pattern in how a character speaks or a theme that keeps returning. From that observation, you create a research question. You shape your idea into something focused and answerable. Next, you do some preliminary reading to see what critics have already said. This helps you avoid repeating old arguments and shows you where new work is needed. After that, you draft the hypothesis, a clear statement that proposes an explanation. Finally, you gather evidence. This can be quotations, thematic patterns, narrative structure, or stylistic features. You check whether the evidence supports the hypothesis or challenges it. In the end, A hypothesis helps keep your research focused. Instead of simply describing what happens in a text, you build a structured argument. You move from observation to question and from question to evidence. That is what makes the study analytical, purposeful, and genuinely scholarly. When we step into the world of literary research, one of the first things we need to understand is the difference between primary data and secondary data. These two categories form the backbone of literary study, and knowing how they work makes research easier, clearer, and much more meaningful. Let's begin with primary data. Primary sources are the original materials, the things you study directly. In literature, this usually means the text itself. So when you read a novel, a poem, or a play, you are working with primary data. But primary sources also include much more than published texts. Manuscripts, first editions, diaries, autobiographies, and letters all count as primary data because they come straight from the writer's world. Even newspapers or archival collections become primary sources when you use them to understand a historical moment connected to a text. Today, accessing primary materials is easier than ever. Online platforms such as Project Gutenberg, Bartleby, and Literature Online make thousands of texts freely available. If you're studying historical context, digital archives like the Times Digital Archive or the 19th century British Library newspapers can be incredibly helpful. And for rare or unpublished material, major archives such as the British Library manuscripts, the National Archives, or CELM, which focuses on early modern literature, preserve unique documents that scholars rely on. Primary data matters because it lets you engage directly with the author's language, choices, and world. Now, let's shift to secondary data, which plays a different but equally important role. Secondary sources are works that interpret, explain, or analyze primary text. When you pick up a book of literary criticism, read a journal article, or check a scholarly survey, you are using secondary material. These sources help you understand how other scholars have read the same text, what debates exist, and which ideas are currently shaping the field. Examples include critical essays, reference works, scholarly books, biographies, and encyclopedias. They don't give you the original story or poem, but they help you understand it more deeply. Researchers also use specialized tools to find secondary material. Databases like ABLE, the Annual Bibliography of English Language and Literature, ABES, the Routledge Annotated Bibliography of English Studies, and the British Humanities Index help scholars locate important critical work quickly. Reference guides such as the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Encyclopaedia Britannica, and Oxford Reference Online point researchers toward reliable secondary sources and background information. So what's the key distinction? It's simple. Primary data gives you the raw material, the text itself, or original historical documents, while secondary data tells you what scholars have said about that raw material. Both are essential. Primary sources allow you to develop your own interpretation, while secondary sources help you connect that interpretation to a wider scholarly conversation. Together, primary and secondary data form a powerful pair. They allow you to read closely, think critically, and contribute meaningfully to literary research.